Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate the kind words. It always worries me when somebody says they're going to go off script during an introduction. I remember speaking at a conference in Prince Edward Island a few years ago, and the fellow who was introducing me went through my background and talked about different things I'd done, and finished off by saying, and he's the proud father of a 10-year-old girl, which was news to me. So thanks for no surprises or extra family members or anything like that this morning. I appreciate that very much. We're going to try to explore a pretty wide range of issues over the course of the morning, talking about innovation and how innovation is affecting your businesses, individual businesses, this region to a certain extent. But I know that the audience is kind of made up of people from a lot of different backgrounds. Some of you are entrepreneurs, some of you are in the process of launching businesses, some of you are with organizations that are serving different kinds of businesses. So I'm going to try to touch base on a number of different elements of things that speak to all of your particular needs. Are we going to get the presentation coming up there? Perfect. So I wanted to talk a little bit at the beginning about the kind of stuff that my company is involved in. Millier Dickinson Blais, as Jeff said, we're the largest economic development consulting firm in Canada at this point. We were started just a couple of years ago. Can you take me right back to the beginning slides there? It's only going in one direction. Okay. We work in the field of economic development, which is essentially the question of how do you attract investment or business to a community? How do you kind of kickstart the local economy and try to get things going? Now, over the course of the 6 years that the company's been up and running, we've had the pleasure to work with more than 200 communities across Canada. And we're starting to work in communities around the world. We're doing more work in the United States, in Ecuador, in Ukraine, different places in Europe. So there's this sense that, while we're out there sort of exploring and working in this field, we're also learning an awful lot about how the economy is changing, how business is reshaping, and how opportunities out there are changing. But one of the first things that we had to come to terms with was that if there's a new kind of economy out there, there probably needs to be a new kind of economic development as well. And this economic development space that we work in really traces its origins back to the 1920s in the state of Georgia in the southern US, where an electrical utility by the name of Georgia Power decided, like all good companies do, that it wanted to grow its profits. It wanted to become a larger and more profitable operation. And it set about looking into a strategy based on the notion that if they could figure out who amongst their existing clients were the biggest users or buyers of electricity, and they could sort of identify who those were, they could attract more of those kinds of users to their service area to grow their business. And no great surprise in 1920s Georgia that the biggest users of electricity were factories. And so Georgia Power set up a sales division whose task it was to go around the world trying to recruit factories to the state of Georgia. Now initially this was a hugely successful strategy. Lots and lots of factories went to Georgia. The state began to grow very rapidly and the company became very profitable. So much so that other utilities all across North America said, hey, if they can do it, maybe we can try to do the same kind of thing. Let's go out and chase those smokestacks. We'll bring those factories to our community. By the 1930s and 40s, municipalities had also picked up on this idea. They didn't want to increase profits the way that a utility did, but they were sort of saying, well, if we could lure a factory to our community, we could generate more tax revenues and have more money available to support all the programs that we want in the local community. Through the 1950s and 60s and 70s, this was the basis of economic development in North America. This was how we grew our communities. This was how we grew Niagara. How do we lure automotive plants into our community? How do we get the big factories to come here? But by the 1980s, things shifted in a little bit of a different direction. The poster child for this process is the community of Flint in Michigan. Now, some of you may have seen Michael Moore's movie, Roger and Me, a few years ago. Michael Moore, the filmmaker, actually comes from Flint. And in that movie, he talks about how in the 1980s, factories began to abandon the community. They began to pack up and move elsewhere, Mexico, China. This created huge problems for the community, and the initial response was, hey, this is a bit of a challenge. Let's think about this in economic development terms. If we're losing factories, maybe our opportunity is to lure more factories back to our community to replace the ones that we're losing. But by the 1980s, there weren't a lot of new factories setting up shop in North America. Remember the first year I started working in economic development back in the mid-90s, there were 12 major branch plants that located into Canada that year. 12 branch plants with more than 500 employees. Well, if you look at the hundreds of communities across Canada, each of which wants to grow and bring investment and create jobs, if there's only 12 winners in that smokestack chasing game, then there's a whole lot more losers and communities that are failing, if that's the focus of our economic development effort. And Flint very quickly realized they weren't going to win at the game of attracting more factories. There were other more desirable places for those factories to go. And soon the folks in Flint began to be faced with additional problems. Those abandoned factories that they've been trying to sell as great locations for new investment began to decay and crumble and fall apart. And suddenly it wasn't just that we needed factories, we needed brownfield redevelopment to bring those new factories. And after a couple of years of this process unfolding, the workers in the community began to say, hey, there's no jobs here. If I want a future, an opportunity to kind of create my own sort of career path or set of opportunities, I'm going to have to go somewhere else. So many of those workers put their houses up for sale. But who was moving to Flint? Nobody. There were no jobs there. The community was starting to fall apart and looked like it was in rough shape. And so those same workers were then confronted with a second decision. Do I abandon my life savings, my house, everything that I've owned, and just leave it here and go somewhere else to start over? Or do I stay here where there aren't going to be that many opportunities? And many of them ended up just walking away from the community. The story of Flint is really the story of a lot of major American cities these days. Flint, as a suburb of Detroit, tells the story of Detroit as a whole. We go back about 20 years, the population of Detroit was a little over 2 million people. Today, the population of Detroit is less than 700,000. The abandoned sections of Detroit are larger than the city of Vancouver. And the number one economic development strategy that the city of Detroit is pursuing these days in its activities is urban agriculture. How do they reclaim these abandoned lands for agricultural use? I don't want to pick just on Detroit or just on Flint. I mean, we see this a lot of places. This is the story we see in places like Cleveland and Buffalo and Rochester. That there's this sort of rust belt that stretches across a tier of the northern states where this struggle is very real and communities are trying to figure out how to survive in this new economy that's emerging. And we're no different in some ways. This is also the challenge of Niagara, that we built an economy around smokestack chasing. We built an economy around big factories. And as that segment of our economy has shrunk, we've really struggled to try to figure out what comes next. What is it that we're going to do to replace those factories? We like to talk about attracting big investments. Maybe that next Toyota plant could come here or something like that. But the reality in the 21st century is that's not what drives local economic development. It's not what's going to drive our local economic development. That we need to start to think in new directions about what we want this community to be and how we're going to build it. One of the things that's always helped me sort of understand the transition that we're going through comes from a speech that the American architect Buckminster Fuller gave back in the 1980s. Some of you may know Buckminster Fuller. He's the guy who sort of invented the geodesic dome, a really interesting kind of thinker and idea person. So in addition to his architectural skills, he was a bit of a futurist, always trying to figure out what comes next. He died in 1983, so this speech that he gave in the 80s was one of the very last speeches that he ever gave. And he said, we're entering the world of the invisible. We're entering an economy that's driven by invisible forces. And what did he mean by that? Essentially, he said, we've always had economic change. Things have always been evolving around us. The horse and buggy was replaced by the automobile. He says, the difference today is that we can't see those changes. In the past, we could see them happening in the streets, outside our homes and outside our offices. We could see there were fewer buggies and more cars. We could see the automotive plants being built. It all happened right in front of our eyes. In the future, Fuller suggested, we won't see the changes as they're taking place. That the changes that drive our economy will happen in virtual spaces. They'll happen online. They'll happen through shared social media spaces, where we prototype and test and explore and research in spaces that don't really exist in the traditional sense, but are nonetheless reshaping what industry does and how it works. Or they'll happen in a field like nanotechnology, where the machines and the industries that we build use technologies that are too small to be seen with the naked eye. The manufacturing processes are essentially invisible to us. And so we don't always sort of see firsthand what they're doing. Or the change that we're talking about happens in fields like biotechnology, where the industrial processes that we want to work with take place inside plants, or inside animals, or inside our own human bodies. Because they take place inside these biological structures, we don't see them. They're invisible. They sneak up on us and catch us unaware. They catch us unprepared. I often think we haven't been good at figuring this part of economic development out. That in some sense we know there's a new economy, we know there's new directions we need to look in, we know there's new ideas we need to wrestle with, but we use the same old tools and the same old approaches to do it. I'm often reminded of a story that comes out of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe in the early 1800s. The French Emperor Napoleon had conquered most of Europe, and the British were terrified that he was going to assemble an invasion fleet, sail across the English Channel, and invade England and conquer England as well. And so to offset this risk, they decided to create an early warning system. Essentially what they did was to hire a guy whose job it was to stand on a beach on the south coast of England every day with a really big bell. And the notion was that he would come down at dawn every morning and scan the horizon all day long, and if on that particular day he should happen to see a French invasion fleet coming his way, he was supposed to start ringing the bell as loudly as he could. And if the people in the village that he walked down from every morning heard that bell down on the beach, they were supposed to run to the local church tower and start ringing the bell in the local church tower to alert the whole village that there was an invasion fleet coming. And that bell was loud enough that the next village up the coast and down the coast could hear it ringing as well. And so they were then to run to their church towers and ring their church bells. And this way they could kind of spread the alarm very rapidly over a large region, mobilize the militia, assemble the troops, and march down to the beach to confront Napoleon before he could establish a beachhead. A really interesting idea, using the technology of the day, kind of a logical approach to some of this stuff. But the British government finally did away with that bell ringer's job in 1945. Napoleon had been dead for well over a century, and some poor guy was going down to the beach with a bell every morning. We know sometimes that we come up with great solutions to the challenges of our day, and then we keep using them over and over and over again, long after they may have passed their sell-by date. I think we often sort of fall into this trap ourselves. I was intrigued this week to see that both Automobile Magazine and Yahoo Motors had named the 2013 Car of the Year already. Does anybody know what they picked? The Tesla Model S. Not a Ford, not a Chrysler, not even a car that uses gasoline. Now we talk about electric cars as something that's coming in the future, something that's down the road, something we're going to see in a few years or in a decade. It's the car of the year next year. This car requires no gas. 0 to 100 kilometers in 5.6 seconds. You could run 500 kilometers on a single charge. And it retails for $50,000. This is the future arriving now. We don't exactly have a showroom for Tesla in Niagara yet, but there's this sense that we will see these on the road in the next few months. And this is one of those changes that sneaks up on us. Here we are in a community that thinks of itself as an automotive community. And yet the changes in this industry still surprise us, still catch us unawares. Something's happening out there, the technology's evolving, the industry's changing, and we weren't aware of it. Now, occasionally, we find people who do have some awareness of what's coming next, who do show us that it is possible to try to figure out what comes next. And nobody backs 1,000 in this field. Nobody gets the future perfect in the prediction game. But there is a sense that if we really step back and think about it, we can see that it is possible to think about what comes next. George Lucas, in the news lots for his entrepreneurial successes over the last few weeks. Part of his eulogy for Steve Jobs suggested that Steve Jobs was one of those people who believed in things that no one else could see. Part of the reason he was successful with Apple and other ventures like Pixar was that he could see some of those invisible things coming down the road. And the challenge for us in trying to recreate this local economy in Niagara, in trying to recreate and reorient our own businesses to succeed in the new economy, is that we've got to become a little more like Steve Jobs. We've got to get better at seeing those invisible things that are coming next. And often what comes next doesn't come from the traditional sources. It's Tesla that built the car of the year for next year, not Ford or Chrysler or General Motors or Volvo or Toyota or Honda or any of the key traditional players. What comes next often comes from surprising places. It doesn't come from the places we would logically expect it to arise from. We're sort of in an economy now where those big, large, traditional players aren't nimble enough to be the real innovators, aren't fast enough or adept enough to make the most significant changes in our economy. The big changes, the big technologies, the big ideas emerge from basements and garages and small startups. And those can come from anywhere. Those can come like Hewlett-Packard from a garage in Palo Alto, California, or those can come from a basement here in St. Catharines. There's no limit to what we can do if we catch that sight of the invisible economy that's emerging. It was part of the theory behind us starting this firm that I'm with now. We launched this about 6 years ago. And we said, the economic development space is broken. If the economy is changing, economic development has to change as well. We have to be able to figure out a new vision, a new set of tools, a new approach. We've got to break the model that was there before and try something completely fresh and completely new. We think that's the one thing that allowed us to make that Profit Magazine Hot 50 list. It wasn't that we had all the answers. It wasn't that we had the best tools available or the most intelligent people in the world on our team, although sometimes we like to think that as well. It was a sense that we were trying something new and something different. We were going to innovate in a space where there wasn't a lot of innovation. And this economy, this market rewards innovation, no matter the space that you're working in. Innovation breeds and leads to success. So think about innovation in the economic development space. We go back a half century, so back in the 1950s, the way that we competed in economic development, the way we tried to attract those factories was we would say, come to our community, we've got the cheapest land. And you wouldn't believe how inexpensive the land is in our community. It's great, we built your factory here. After a while that didn't work so well. We shifted our argument to, come to our community because we've got the lowest taxes. Taxes isn't much of a driver of economic development. We work in communities all around the world. I've never been to a community where they say their taxes are too low. Every community we go to agrees taxes are too high, and I don't like taxes any more than anybody else. But having low taxes is not going to lure investment to your community. Taxes are kind of a marginal cost for most businesses, and a shift in taxes can add up to a few percentage points in a project. Taxes are not the basis of competition. We flash forward again a few years ago and we said, okay, let's compete on the basis of who's got the cheapest labor. This is what China and Mexico were doing to us to lure investment away in the 90s. Who's got the cheapest workers? If we can find the cheapest workers, that's the best place to go. But that doesn't work today either. There's only one driver of economic development in this new economy. Only one thing that makes communities competitive. It's knowledge. This economy is driven by innovation, by ideas, by technology, and all of that is based in knowledge. What are the skills, what are the capacities, what are the capabilities of your local workforce, of your local business community? How much do they know and how do they use that information, that knowledge, to drive new opportunities? That's a bit of a truism. We've been saying it for years and years, but in this economy, it's more true than ever, that knowledge is power. Knowledge drives innovation. Education, training, skills drive economic development. And to a large extent, none of those other traditional factors matter anymore. Well, that's kind of interesting because we have a pretty unique advantage in this space. If you look at Canada as a whole, we're pretty good in the knowledge game. But if you factor out the rest of Canada and just look at that Quebec to Windsor corridor, this one small piece of geography that we're a part of is in fact the most knowledge-intensive region in the world. This is the most highly educated region in the world. There is nobody else anywhere who measures up on the knowledge scale. We don't tend to think of that. We sort of think, oh, well, we do okay. And we know in Niagara we've got some challenges on the educational attainment side. We know that there's some real risks in terms of whether or not our education is aligned with the kinds of needs that industry has in the future. I think this is pretty compelling, pretty powerful information. That when we factor out Northern Ontario, when we factor out other provinces, when we sort of look just at this specific region, we have the driving force of this economy in a greater concentration than anybody else. And one of the things that allows us to do is to begin to be better at innovation than many other places. One of the realities of innovation is that it isn't following a single path. Innovation happens in multiple ways and plays out in multiple directions all at once. We can find multiple solutions to problems. If we can identify those invisible problems, those invisible challenges driving the economy, we can find lots of different ways to get around them, to overcome them, to move through them. And so there isn't a simple, single solution to how do I bring innovation to my business or my community. But there is a sense that by combining the forces and effects of this knowledge base that we have, we can begin to define multiple solutions to the challenges in front of us. One of the key outcomes of this kind of a process, that the constant drive for innovation and finding new solutions, is the companies that dominate this new economy are very different than the kind of companies we had in the past. One of the key thinkers in this area is a business writer named Michael Malone, who suggests that we're looking at a new kind of company that will succeed and thrive in this new economy. And it's a company that can essentially reinvent itself over and over and over again. That what worked in the past doesn't work today. Sitting on the shore, south coast of England with a bell was a really good idea for its time, but it doesn't cut it today. Same's true in business. We have to constantly and consistently reinvent ourselves. And one of the ways that Malone suggests that we can do that is through what he calls competence aggregation. If knowledge is the driver of this economy, then you want to aggregate, you want to collect, you want to gather competence and knowledge inside your company. Or you want to partner with other companies that have it. There's been a lot of work showing what kinds of companies are best at pursuing this approach to innovation. Gary Hamel is a business consultant from the Chicago area. He's the guy who first invented the notion of core competencies. That was a sort of a big business idea a few years ago. He's actually looked at who are the companies that are going to be innovating in the future. And for those of you who are working trying to build economic development and innovation in the community, this is a great resource. He's actually thought about what kinds of companies are the true leading innovators in our local economies. And not only has he described the kinds of things that they do, but he's actually begun to think about specific examples of models of each of those types of innovative companies. So you can sort of think of a real-world kind of set of characteristics to understand the kind of the larger ideas that he's talking about. But that there are specific kinds of firms that tend to high levels of innovation, and that these firms are the ones that are likely to drive our economy moving forward. So that's great information if you're sort of out there in the economic development space or the business counseling space or some of these kinds of things. But what about the rest of us who are in the trenches trying to start a new business, trying to run a small entrepreneurial venture, trying to get one off the ground, thinking about what we might start in the next few weeks or months? How do we sort of start to take this idea and apply it to the tough situation of being an entrepreneur? Well, I think part of what we need to think about is that two kinds of businesses essentially dominate that space of new and growing ventures. We can look at that list of all the innovative companies from Gary Hamel, and we know that, no matter what our ambitions are, we are not yet Google or Hulu or Ford or companies like that. We can talk about, at the small end of the scale, what do we need to do to be innovative and inventive? I want to point us in two directions. One is the notion of lone eagles. I'm going to come back to both of these in a minute. Lone eagles is an idea that's been around in economic development circles for some time. But I was struggling to kind of think of, well, what's the opposite of lone eagles? What's the contrast of lone eagles? And I'm not much of a wildlife expert. I was really struggling to come up with another bird that I could compare to a lone eagle. And what I essentially settled on was that those of you who are not lone eagles are Egyptian plovers. I'm not an expert on Egyptian plovers, so forgive my tortured analogies as we sort of stretch this a little too far. The Egyptian plover is the bird that cleans the teeth of crocodiles. And as an entrepreneur, I'm sure that's a kind of a model that many of you can recognize and sort of sympathize with. A dangerous place to be when you're seeking nourishment. So let me talk about each of these two models. I want to start with the Egyptian plovers. The Egyptian plovers is this kind of term that I've invented to come up with a descriptor for those businesses who are offering their services locally. I know the folks who work in the Small Business Enterprise Center, here in St. Catharines or in Niagara Falls, a good chunk of those who come in for help are saying, I want to start a hair salon. I want to start a dog grooming business. I want to start home renovation businesses. These are the Egyptian plovers. These are the kinds of companies that are servicing a local market. Their customer base, their client base is here in the Niagara region. I think this is an interesting sort of position to be in, because we talk about innovation, we talk about globalization and trade and research and commercialization. If you're running a hair salon, it's hard to figure out sometimes what that means for you. What's that all about? So I want to say this is one of the things that we need to sort of focus on as we talk about innovation. What does it mean for the plovers in the group? How do you innovate these small, locally focused businesses? Now, in the economic development space, as we talk about competitiveness and competition, we suggest that there are really three ways that you can be competitive. And I think those three models apply to these kinds of locally focused businesses as well. You can offer what's referred to as cost leadership. In essence, you can say, I want to be the cheapest out there at what I do. And that's a way to kind of capture some market share. That's not a strategy that we often recommend. Being the cheapest doesn't always lead to great rewards at the other end of the business, and is often sort of subject to somebody coming along a little later to be even cheaper. What we suggest is one of the other two strategies: differentiation or segmentation. Differentiation is the notion that how do you make your product unique? If there are 100 hair salons in town, how do you make yours different from all the others? What can you offer in terms of services, in terms of space, in terms of additional offers or additional value? What can you offer that nobody else is bringing to the table? And if you can find a way to differentiate yourself, to innovate what makes your company stand out from others, then that's a pathway to success. The other way to sort of think of innovation in this space is to think of segmentation. How do I focus my business not on doing this entire, if I'm in the dog grooming business, am I really sort of doing everything everywhere? Or am I going to sort of focus on a very narrow niche of this space and become the best there is at it? Am I going to carve out a reputation as highly specialized, highly knowledgeable, highly trained, so that what makes me competitive in the marketplace is that I look so much better to a prospective client because of that specialization that I've carved out? These notions of differentiation and segmentation are not things that most of us have time to think about in this locally driven space. And yet, if we really want to innovate our businesses for this new marketplace, this is the pathway to do it. Now, many of the rest of us are in the space that economic developers call lone eagles. This is the notion of an entrepreneurially driven business where more than 75% of your income, 75% of your client base exists outside your own community. Lone eagles choose where to live and where to operate their businesses because they love the place they're working from, because of quality of life, or because of sort of specific choices about what a community offers to them. They can do business anywhere, and in fact, often do business anywhere. They're sort of constantly on the go and constantly traveling. And the competition for lone eagles is not the local market. It's really the global market. In economic development, I'm not competing against other economic developers in Niagara. I'm competing against other economic development consulting firms in Boston and New York and London and Shanghai. That's my competition. So I can live anywhere, and I choose to live in St. Catharines. But my business is all around the world. In this space, there are also three potential drivers of innovation. One is disruptive technology. If I can invent something new to do my work, then I can get a leap, get out ahead of many of the others playing in the same space that I'm in. The second is to develop customized or bespoke, highly specialized kinds of products. Can I offer something that nobody else is yet able to offer? Can I get ahead of the marketplace? Can I see where that invisible economy is going next and try to create a service or a product that's a generation ahead of my competitors, or that offers something that's specific to the needs of one small segment of my client base? And if I can do that, I'm more likely to be successful. And finally, there's this area of thought leadership, and this is one of the areas that our firm is really sort of focused on in terms of trying to differentiate ourselves from others in the economic development space. It's not enough just to sort of describe what's happening. It's not enough to just kind of have products and services. But if you can establish the notion that you are seeing that invisible future better than others, and you can lead other people there, you can help introduce people to what's coming next, then that's of great value in the marketplace. If you can suggest that your insights, your knowledge, your information is leading in directions that others will find productive, they'll start to follow. In the same sense that when you start tweeting, first you get your friends and family, right? But if you can start to build a big group of followers, that's your thought leadership, in a sense, exhibiting itself on the ground. You can sort of take that analogy into the corporate space. How do you become the one with the great ideas? How do you share those great ideas? How do you communicate them to your marketplace, to your peers, to your colleagues, to your partners? Now, in the consulting space that I work in, the old model was you get a bunch of knowledge and you guard it, you keep it, and then you sell it in little bits and chunks. I'm an expert. I have all the answers. Hire me and I'll come give you an answer. Today, we take the opposite approach. We say, look, there's so much information, there's so much change. We're in this new economy together. If I've got insights, if I've got ideas, I've got to share them with you. They're of no value if I hide them. They're only useful if we're all able to tap into them and make use of them. Information is powerful only when it's shared. And so by sharing information, I demonstrate the fact that I have it. I demonstrate expertise, I demonstrate knowledge, I demonstrate insight. And when somebody wants to hire a consultant, that's the kind of thing they think about. So in some sense, we end up giving away a lot of our product to show people that they should buy our product. It's a very different kind of economy than the past. The interesting thing about this lone eagle space is that some of the research shows that about 100% of all new jobs created in North America since 2000, net new jobs, have been driven out of this space. They haven't come from traditional economic sectors. They haven't come from the manufacturing sector. It's been these lone eagles innovating with new ideas and new approaches that have been the only net job creators in the North American economy. Now, we've been through a pretty rough spot in the economy over the last few years. But if this has been successful in the worst economy in decades and decades and decades, we can imagine how it may take off once the economy rights itself and begins to move in interesting new directions. I think one of the things that we learned from watching the lone eagles and the way they work as well is that innovation may start with individuals, individual ideas, and individual research, but innovation flourishes through sharing, cooperation, and collaboration. Innovation works best in a team environment when I can take that innovative idea or technology and share it as widely as possible. This ties in with some really interesting work being done at business schools in the States. This particular publication comes out of Wharton in Pennsylvania. The notion that rather than competing country against country or firm against firm in this new economy, the way that competition works in the new economy is network against network, team against team. None of us, none of our businesses sit in isolation anymore. We cannot go it alone in this economy. Only by constructing teams are we able to compete and succeed in this new economy. This is reshaping how we think about the world in some ways. I did my academic studies in international relations, and one of the theories that's popped up there in recent years is the notion of the Golden Arches theory of peace, which basically states that no two countries with McDonald's have ever gone to war against each other. Interesting to note that Iran does not have a McDonald's, so I'm hedging my bets on that one. Now, this has been a subject of much controversy. Does this really mean anything? The suggestion is that, well, if we've got McDonald's, we're at a certain stage of development, we're in a certain kind of economy, and it doesn't make sense to shoot missiles at each other anymore. We can compete or solve our problems in other ways. But it is kind of a sort of a frivolous example, and it's prompted a sort of a more sophisticated theory based on the same idea. Thomas Friedman, the New York journalist, suggested initially this notion of the Dell supply chain theory of peace, where he posited that no two companies in the Dell Computers supply chain have ever gone to war with each other. Well, this one has a little more academic credibility, and the basic notion again is, our supply chains, our partnerships, our networks for competition in this economy are global. And you don't want to go to war against your suppliers, necessarily. You want to destroy your own product base. You don't want to attack your market. And so the more global the economy becomes, the more the team, the network, the value chain becomes important. I think this is interesting because it suggests that Part of what we need to think about as we think about where our individual businesses go, no matter how small, is to think about what globalization means in the context of our businesses. We're in an era of globalization. We all know that. But some of the people who study this stuff say we're actually in globalization 3.0. We're no longer at this sort of what we tend to think of as globalization as countries competing against countries all around the world, or this sort of massive kind of market that's based on national distinctions. They say that's the story of globalization 1.0, which began in 1492 and ended around 1800. This was the era in which countries sought to globalize themselves, in which European powers established international empires. And the driving force of globalization was the acquisition of land and territory and resources. We know this ends around 1800 because all of those countries that were going out trying to acquire empires began to sell them off, beginning in 1803 when Napoleon sold off the Louisiana Purchase to the United States. And we can see that over the next half century or so, Britain starts granting independence to countries like Canada. Russia sells off Alaska. Suddenly these imperial powers are saying, hey, globalization doesn't make sense for countries anymore. And we usher in the era of globalization 2.0, when companies begin to globalize. Started first by companies like the British East India Company, Hudson's Bay Company. The companies are established to go out and identify markets internationally, to establish an international presence, to access labor and resources all around the world. And globalization 2.0 takes us from the early 1800s round to about the year 2000. Companies in this period are the primary drivers of globalization. You go global through your company. We're now entering what we can call globalization 3.0, in which neither countries nor companies are the driver of globalization, but individuals. Each of us are the drivers of globalization. As we look to establish networks and teams and partnerships, value chains, supply chains for our companies, we are reaching out to other players around the world. It's not our government that does that. It's not our company that does that. It's us as entrepreneurs that are establishing these global networks to make our businesses work. And those global networks are really what drive and shape and provide opportunities for us. And even in those small, locally driven businesses, the value of those contacts is significant. If you can cut out the middleman, disintermediation, they call it in the technology space, and access your supplier directly. This is the game that Walmart has played, but it's also a game that technology now allows every small business to play. But at every level of the business world, we are now trying to construct and develop these global networks that will allow our companies to become great innovators. I think this is exciting. In some sense, Niagara has always been a center of innovation. You think about the kind of vision that led to the creation of the Welland Canal. The individuals 175 years ago who sat down and said, we should think about building a canal in this region. This impossible dream of linking two Great Lakes and bypassing the falls. The scale and scope of what they imagined is almost unthinkable these days. How many of us could sort of marshal the resources and the investments and the technology and the labor to pull that off? And yet this is part of our community's heritage. This is part of the story that says innovation can happen here. Innovation does happen here. What's our role in this? Well, we're the next generation of that story. We have to start to say, those were the innovators of the past. How do we become the innovators and the drivers and the reshapers of our community today? What is it that we can do, big or small, through our ventures, through our businesses, through our community initiatives? What can we do to get this new and innovative economy off the ground? How can we help to see the invisible space that we're moving into? How do I take some of these ideas and apply them to my own business? Because that's the only opportunity we're going to have to recreate this community. We can't rely on smokestacks and factories coming from somewhere else. We can't imagine that some national government is going to win the globalization game and that's going to trickle down to us. We can't imagine that multinational corporations are going to solve our problems for us. It's all down to us as entrepreneurs. We are the ones who are going to recreate this economy. That's a big responsibility, big set of challenges. And I want to sort of wrap up this morning with one story that helps me come to terms with some of the weight of history that puts on our shoulders. It's a story that comes out of Czechoslovakia in 1989. You may recall that in 1989 there were a series of popular revolutions sweeping across Eastern Europe, deposing the old communist governments, replacing them with more popularly supported governments. And in places like Hungary and Poland and East Germany, there were massive people power movements that took to the streets, and it caused those governments in those countries to essentially melt away. But in Czechoslovakia, things didn't quite follow the same path. The students of Czechoslovakia took to the streets in the tens of thousands. But very quickly after they began to march, the Czechoslovakian riot police moved in, attacked those students, beat those students, killed some of those students. And for more than a week after that happened, Czechoslovakia fell silent. The people there were too afraid to speak out for change. These great waves of change were sweeping across the region all around them, but Czechoslovakia was an island of silence. And finally, one man, a man by the name of Philip Merrick, decided that he couldn't be silent any longer. And he went to the street corner where the students had been beaten and killed, and he started to talk. He just talked about his vision of what his nation and his community could become. And while he was talking, a few more people stopped to listen to him, and then a few more. And then the city police showed up, but they weren't quite sure what to do, so they decided to wait for the riot police. And while they were waiting, somebody started talking on the corner across the street. By nightfall, there were 25,000 people gathered at that intersection. And by the end of that week, there were 250,000 people gathering every day in Wenceslas Square. And before he knew what had happened, the government of Czechoslovakia had been swept from power. And Philip Merrick, the fellow who touched that off, he was a 14-year-old boy. If one 14-year-old boy can transform an entire country, then I think there are lots of opportunities for us as innovators, as entrepreneur supporters, to change this community as well, to revitalize and revive and re-strengthen the things that happen here. We've got a 200-year tradition of innovation in this community. We're the legacy of that long tradition. And when I think about what we can do next, I think it's really exciting. So thank you very much, and good luck.